Someone you grew up watching might have been a monster, and no one told you. Behind the bright lights and perfect smiles of old Hollywood was a world built on secrets, silence, and survival. These stars weren't just acting on screen. They were acting every day to hide addictions, affairs, double lives, and even disturbing truths. The studios had ways of keeping things quiet, from controlling the press to carefully crafting public images. What looked like glamour was often something much darker. Some of these stories were buried for decades. Others were never meant to be found. But now we're pulling back the curtain, so grab a cup of coffee and prepare for some of the darkest secrets Hollywood tried to hide. Joan Crawford was Hollywood's ultimate leading lady, hiding a terrifying truth behind her lipstick smile. Joan Crawford had it all: beauty, talent, power. She wasn't just a star, she was a force. But what if the woman America adored was nothing like the mother behind closed doors? For decades, Joan's image was untouchable, carefully crafted by studios, and even more carefully maintained by Joan herself. But then, years after her death, her adopted daughter published a book that changed everything. Mommy Dearest wasn't just a memoir, it was a bombshell. It painted a picture of a woman who ruled her home with fear, not love. A woman obsessed with control, appearances, and staying in the spotlight, even at home. Some called it revenge. Others called it the truth. The question is, was Joan a victim of a cruel smear campaign, or was the mask of Hollywood's golden girl finally slipping? One thing's certain, once you hear the stories, it's hard to watch her movies the same way again. Errol Flynn, Hollywood's original bad boy, didn't just break hearts, he shattered reputations. Errol Flynn looked like the perfect movie hero, charming, fearless, always ready with a sly grin and a sword in hand. But behind that leading man image was a real-life story that felt more like a scandal sheet than a script. In the early 1940s, Flynn was dragged into a high-profile trial after two young women accused him of crossing serious lines. The courtroom was a circus. Fans swore he was innocent. The press couldn't get enough. And while he was ultimately cleared, his reputation was never the same. But the drama didn't stop there. Flynn had a taste for chaos, endless parties, strange friendships, and a private life that raised a lot of eyebrows. Later in life, some even claimed he had dangerous political connections during wartime. Was it recklessness? Was it arrogance? Or did Flynn just think the rules didn't apply to him? One thing's for sure, his off-screen life was more explosive than anything Hollywood could write. Marilyn Monroe, the most desired woman in the world, but did she know too much? Marilyn Monroe was more than a movie star, she was a symbol. Beauty, innocence, sex appeal, vulnerability, all wrapped into one unforgettable face. But behind the soft voice and platinum curls was someone far more complex and maybe far more dangerous to the people around her than anyone realized. Marilyn had powerful lovers, and not just in the gossip column sense. We're talking high-ranking, political, world-shifting men. Presidents. Brothers. Secrets whispered on the phone at night. She knew things she wasn't supposed to. She asked questions she shouldn't have. And the more her life unraveled, through pills, heartbreaks, and betrayals, the closer she seemed to get to something people didn't want her near. Then one night, she was gone. Just like that. Official story, a tragic accident. But people have been raising eyebrows ever since. The timelines don't add up. The phone calls don't make sense. And too many people who knew her went silent. Was it all just the collapse of a fragile icon, or something more calculated? Marilyn may have died alone, but her story still refuses to rest. Natalie Wood, a Hollywood sweetheart lost at sea, with questions that still haunt the waves. Natalie Wood was the picture of innocence on screen, soft-spoken, graceful, beloved by millions. But her real life had a tension running through it, like something just beneath the surface. Maybe that's what made her final night so chilling. Thanksgiving weekend, 1981. Natalie's on a yacht with her husband, Robert Wagner, and her co-star, Christopher Walken. Then, sometime in the night, she vanishes. Hours later, her body is found floating in the water, dressed in a nightgown and jacket. The official word: a tragic accident. She fell overboard. Case closed, or was it? Over the years, new witnesses came forward. Stories changed. And even her husband's account started to raise red flags. In fact, decades later, the case was quietly reclassified, and Wagner named a person of interest. Yet no charges. No answers. Just silence. What really happened on that boat? An argument? A fall? Something worse? Natalie Wood's death isn't just a Hollywood mystery. It's a wound that never quite healed. Montgomery Clift, He had the looks of a god and the sadness of a man who couldn't be himself. Montgomery Clift wasn't just another handsome actor, he was different. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, like he was carrying something too heavy for the screen to capture. And he was. In a town built on image, Monty lived with a secret that could have ended his career overnight. He loved who he wasn't allowed to love. So he hid it. Every day. And that pressure, it chipped away at him. Then came the car crash. One moment changed everything. His face, once flawless, was shattered. Physically he recovered. But inside, something broke. He pulled away from friends, leaned into the bottle, and acted like he was trying to disappear. His performances after the accident were haunting, some say because he wasn't acting anymore. Elizabeth Taylor once called him the most beautiful man who ever lived. But even she couldn't save him from the pain that never left. In the end, Montgomery Clift became a legend not just for what he did on screen, but for the sorrow he couldn't hide off it. Fatty Arbuckle, he was the king of comedy, until one night turned laughter into suspicion. Before Chaplin, before Keaton, there was Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. He was one of the highest-paid stars in silent film, a man who made millions laugh without saying a word. But in 1921, everything changed. Arbuckle threw a party at a San Francisco hotel. Champagne flowed, the guest list glittered. But by the end of the night, a young actress named Virginia Rappe was rushed to the hospital. Days later, she was gone. Fingers pointed at Arbuckle. The headlines exploded. Hollywood's golden clown became a public villain overnight. 3 trials followed. One hung jury, another mistrial. Finally, after months of scandal, Arbuckle was cleared. Innocent legally, but not in the court of public opinion. His films were pulled, his career destroyed, and though he tried to come back, the damage was done. What really happened in that hotel room? No one can say for sure. But Fatty Arbuckle's fall remains one of the darkest, most debated crashes in Hollywood history. Proof that in this town, your legacy can vanish in a single night. Charlie Chaplin, the man who made the world laugh, spent his life hiding from its judgment. Charlie Chaplin was more than a comedian, he was a global icon. With nothing but a hat, a cane, and a wobble in his walk, he became the most famous man on earth. But behind the camera, Chaplin's life wasn't so lighthearted. He had a fascination with much younger women, much younger. Several of his relationships sparked controversy, even in his own time. He married a 16-year-old when he was in his 30s. Another bride was still a teenager when she accused him of things that dragged him into a very public courtroom. He settled, but the scandal stuck. Then there were the politics. Chaplin spoke out against fascism and war, noble causes sure. But in Cold War America, that was enough to get you branded a threat. In 1952, the U.S. effectively shut the door on him. No charges, no trial, just gone. Exiled from the country where he made his name. Charlie Chaplin, the man who gave us joy during the darkest times, spent his final years watching from a distance, wondering how quickly admiration can turn into suspicion. Marlon Brando, he could command a room with a whisper, but couldn't escape the chaos in his own home. Marlon Brando changed acting forever. He didn't just play characters, he became them. Raw, unpredictable, magnetic. But the intensity that made him great on screen followed him into real life, where things were far less scripted. Brando's personal world was full of turmoil, a mansion filled with secrets, fractured relationships, and deep emotional wounds that ran through his family. One of his sons was involved in a high-profile crime that shocked the nation. Another child suffered in silence until it was too late. And Brando, haunted by it all, retreated deeper into isolation. He blamed himself for not being able to protect the people he loved. Some say he was too distant. Others say he carried more guilt than anyone ever knew. For all his fame, Brando's life became a cautionary tale. A man with unimaginable talent, surrounded by pain he couldn't fix. On screen, he was a legend. Off-screen, he was trying to survive a storm he never saw coming. Vivien Leigh, she played Southern royalty on screen, but behind the curtain, her world was spinning out of control. Vivien Leigh gave us Scarlett O'Hara, a role so iconic, it burned itself into film history. But while the world admired her elegance and fire, Vivien was quietly fighting a battle no one could see. Her mood swung like a pendulum, one moment full of life and laughter, the next distant, volatile, unreachable. Friends whispered about episodes, but no one had the words for it back then. Mental health wasn't something Hollywood talked about. It was something they hid. Vivien tried to keep performing, even when the pressure became unbearable. Her marriage to fellow star Laurence Olivier, once seen as a fairy tale, crumbled under the weight of her unraveling mind. She pushed herself to the edge for her art, sometimes too far. And though she kept smiling for the cameras, those who knew her saw the cracks forming. Vivien Leigh's story isn't just about talent. It's about what happens when the spotlight shines too bright and no one sees the person standing in the shadows. Peter Lorre, he gave villains their voice, but couldn't silence the darkness inside himself. Peter Lorre had a face you couldn't forget, a voice that sent chills through every line he delivered. He played criminals, madmen, and twisted geniuses with eerie ease. But that haunting energy didn't stop when the director yelled cut. Lorre carried a kind of weight with him, something you could feel but couldn't name. He struggled for years with a dependence on medication, something that started quietly and grew into a full-blown battle. In a time when actors were expected to stay silent about personal pain, he turned inward, relying on pills to get through the day, the night, and everything in between. Hollywood typecast him as the strange, broken soul, but maybe that was closer to the truth than anyone knew. He was deeply intelligent, often isolated, and always on the edge of something darker than his characters. Peter Lorre didn't just play tortured men, he understood them. Because in many ways, he was one. George Reeves, he played Superman, but even heroes fall under suspicious skies. To an entire generation, George Reeves was Superman, truth, justice, and the American way, wrapped in a cape and a confident smile. But off-screen, his life told a very different story. Reeves wanted to be taken seriously as an actor, but the cape became a cage. Directors couldn't see past the costume, and Reeves felt trapped in a role he couldn't escape. Then, in 1959, he was found in his home, gone suddenly and under circumstances that didn't sit right with anyone. The official word: he made the choice himself. But the details were strange. The scene didn't add up. There were people in the house that night. Multiple versions of the story. A Hollywood relationship that was far more complicated than fans ever knew. Some whispered about jealousy. Others about powerful connections and a rushed investigation. Decades later, the questions remain. Did George Reeves simply lose hope, or did someone else write his final chapter? Whatever the truth, the man who played a hero left behind a mystery that still refuses to be solved. William Holden, he was the golden boy of Hollywood until the light faded and no one was watching. William Holden had the kind of charm that didn't need effort, cool, rugged, with a voice that made everything sound just a little more important. He won an Oscar, starred in classics, and seemed like the guy everyone wanted to be. But behind the calm exterior was a man slowly drifting out of reach. Holden wrestled quietly with the pressures of fame and the weight of his own expectations. He turned to the bottle, not in a dramatic public way, but in the quiet, private way that eats away at you over time. Friends noticed him pulling back. The roles got fewer. The spark dimmed. Then came the final blow. He suffered a fall at home. A simple accident, but one that no one was there to catch. Hours passed before anyone even found him. It was a lonely end for someone who once stood at the very center of the spotlight. William Holden lived like a movie star, but his final chapter was all too human. Quiet, tragic, and heartbreakingly forgotten. Dorothy Dandridge, she broke barriers on screen and was broken by the system off it. Dorothy Dandridge was a trailblazer, the first black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar. She was elegance, talent, and poise in a time when Hollywood offered women like her little more than side roles and stereotypes. But Dorothy didn't just break through, she shattered expectations. Still, even as the applause rang out, the doors stayed closed. Roles dried up. Offers came with strings. Studios praised her beauty, but kept her in a box. And in her personal life? Even more heartbreak. Failed marriages. Financial struggles. A daughter she couldn't care for the way she wanted to, no matter how hard she tried. Dorothy fought to stay in the spotlight, but Hollywood didn't fight for her. By the end, she was living alone, barely getting by, an icon left out of the very history she helped shape. She deserved more. Still does. Dorothy Dandridge wasn't just a star. She was a symbol of grace under pressure, and a warning about how quickly Hollywood forgets the ones who dared to challenge it. Hedy Lamarr, she was called most beautiful woman in the world, but her real genius had nothing to do with looks. Hedy Lamarr lit up the screen like no one else, elegant, mysterious, untouchable. She was the very image of Hollywood glamour. But here's what they didn't tell you. When she wasn't acting, she was inventing. Seriously, Hetty co-developed a radio system during World War II that later became the foundation for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, even GPS. But back then, no one cared. Studios told her to stick to looking pretty. She offered her ideas to the government. They ignored her. Instead of being honored, she was dismissed, even laughed at. As her film career faded, so did the recognition she deserved. She went from red carpets to courtrooms, suing over stolen images and fighting to hold on to what little was left. Hedy Lamarr died in near obscurity, her brilliance barely acknowledged. Only years later did the world finally say what should have been said all along. She wasn't just a pretty face, she was a mind ahead of its time. A woman who could have changed the world, if only they'd let her. Jean Tierney, her beauty was legendary, but one fan's mistake turned her life into a lifelong heartbreak. Jean Tierney was the kind of stunning that stopped people in their tracks, flawless on camera, graceful off it. But behind that porcelain-perfect image was a story that no Hollywood script could make up. In the early 1940s, Jean was pregnant with her first child. During a public appearance, she greeted fans, even though she wasn't feeling well. What she didn't know was that one of them had recently broken quarantine, while sick, just to meet her. That single moment changed everything. Jean's daughter was born with severe disabilities tied to the exposure. And Jean, racked with guilt, never fully recovered. She kept acting, kept smiling, but inside, the pain never left. Over time, she began to suffer deeply, emotionally and mentally. There were treatments, some of them harsh, and long stretches away from the spotlight. People saw the beauty. Few saw the cost. Jean Tierney's life was marked by a single, random encounter, and a kind of grief that no fame, no applause could ever erase. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, had a secret he took to the grave, but the truth found its way out. Clark Gable was the ultimate leading man, tough, charming, larger than life. When he spoke, audiences listened. When he smiled, the world swooned. But behind the swagger and stardom was a tightly guarded secret, one that wouldn't fully come to light until long after he was gone. During the filming of a 1935 movie, Gable had a brief relationship with his co-star, Loretta Young. She later disappeared from public view for months. When she re-emerged, she claimed to have adopted a baby girl. But the truth? That child was Gable's daughter. The studio covered it up. Loretta kept quiet. Gable never acknowledged the child publicly, not once. And for decades, the world had no idea. The little girl grew up not knowing who her father really was. It wasn't until years later, through family whispers and DNA tests, that the truth finally surfaced. Gable's image stayed spotless, but now we know, even the king had shadows he never let the spotlight touch. Loretta Young, America's sweetheart, staged the perfect comeback, but it was hiding a secret too painful to speak aloud. Loretta Young was the picture of grace, elegant, devout, and always carefully composed. But behind her poised image was a secret so heavy, she kept it hidden for most of her life, even from her own daughter. In the mid-1930s, during the filming of a movie with Clark Gable, Loretta became pregnant. She vanished from the public eye for months, then suddenly returned with a newly adopted baby girl. The truth? That baby was hers, and Gable's. But because of the pressures of fame, religion, and the iron grip of the studio system, she felt she had no choice but to create a lie big enough to live inside. For decades, her daughter didn't know who her real father was, or that she was the product of anything other than a quiet adoption. Loretta's image as a wholesome, morally upright star remained untouched, while a personal truth quietly gnawed at the edges of that perfect picture. It wasn't just a hidden story, it was a life rewritten, all to protect a secret the world wasn't ready to hear. Spencer Tracy, Hollywood's favorite everyman, lived a double life no script could explain. Spencer Tracy was the definition of classic. Rugged, humble, and endlessly watchable, he made every role feel honest, even when his real life was anything but. Off-screen, Tracy carried a heavy weight, a lifelong struggle with drinking, and a deeply complicated personal life he kept tucked far from the public eye. He was married, yes, but he and his wife lived separately for most of their adult lives. Why? Because for over 25 years, he was in a devoted but discreet relationship with Katharine Hepburn. They never lived together. They never married. And for decades, they never even acknowledged their bond publicly. Why the secrecy? Part of it was loyalty. He refused to divorce his wife, especially after their son was born with special needs. Part of it was fear. Hollywood wasn't built for honesty. So Tracy played the part of the devoted family man, while living a life full of emotional contradictions. He was loyal to everyone and torn between them all. Spencer Tracy's greatest role might not have been in a film, but in how carefully he played himself. Katharine Hepburn, she was bold, brilliant, and unbreakable, but the truth about her love life stayed locked behind studio doors. Katharine Hepburn wasn't like the other starlets. She wore pants when no one else did, said what she thought, and never seemed to care what anyone expected of her. She was fierce, independent, and one of the most decorated actors in history. But for all her outspokenness, there was one thing she never talked about: her personal life. Her decades-long relationship with Spencer Tracy was never made official, never discussed, and always kept in the shadows. Some say it was out of respect. Tracy was married. Others suggest it was part of a bigger truth. Rumors swirled for years about Hepburn's private world, that she lived by her own rules, loved who she wanted, and simply refused to explain herself. In her later years, a close friend even hinted that she never felt the need to pretend for anyone. Was she protecting her image or protecting her freedom? Katharine Hepburn didn't leave behind a confession. She left behind a mystery, and maybe that was her way of staying in control until the very end. Bela Lugosi, he brought Dracula to life, but couldn't outrun the ghosts in his own. Bela Lugosi was Dracula, not just in costume, but in presence, elegant, haunting, unforgettable. Audiences were captivated, but the truth was the role that made him famous also became a kind of curse. Lugosi was typecast almost immediately. Hollywood saw only one thing when they looked at him: a vampire. And slowly, the doors to serious roles began to close. Behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. To keep performing, to keep working, Lugosi turned to medication, something he thought he could control. But it didn't stay that way. What started as a solution quietly became a dependence. As the roles dried up, so did the spotlight. Once hailed as a horror legend, Lugosi found himself in low-budget films, barely recognized, barely respected. He eventually checked himself into rehab, something almost unheard of at the time for a public figure. In the end, Bela Lugosi didn't just play a man cursed to live in the shadows. He became one. Not because of some monster on screen, but because the world forgot there was a man underneath the cape. Greta Garbo, she had the whole world watching, and all she wanted was to disappear. Greta Garbo was unlike anyone Hollywood had ever seen: cool, distant, magnetic. She didn't chase fame. Fame chased her. Audiences couldn't get enough, but Garbo? She couldn't get far enough away. At the peak of her stardom, she walked away from it all. No farewell tour, no grand announcement. Just silence. She was only 35. Why would someone so beloved vanish so suddenly? Some said she hated the machine, the press, the control, the pressure to be someone she wasn't. Others whispered about her personal life, the close relationships with women she never explained, and the quiet, fiercely protected privacy she built like a wall around herself. Garbo never married, never gave tell-all interviews, never played the fame game. Instead, she lived out her days walking the streets of New York alone, refusing to be anyone's spectacle. "I want to be left alone," she once said. And she meant it. In a town where everyone fights to be seen, Greta Garbo's greatest act was vanishing before anyone could take the real her away. Rita Hayworth, she was the dream on every movie screen, and the woman who quietly faded before anyone noticed. Rita Hayworth was the fantasy. The red lips, the tumbling hair, the sultry smile. She was the poster on 1,000 walls during World War II. The woman soldiers dreamed of coming home to. But behind that image was someone far more fragile. Born Margarita Cancino, Rita was reshaped by Hollywood. Her name changed, her hairline raised, her identity rewritten to fit the mold of a marketable star. She became what the studio needed, until they didn't. She married 5 times, including to a prince, but none of those fairy tales lasted. One marriage left her shattered, another barely noticed she was slipping. In her later years, Rita began to forget lines, then people, then pieces of herself. For years, the world whispered that she just let herself go. In reality, she was battling a disease no one understood then: Alzheimer's. Rita Hayworth didn't just fade from a spotlight, she faded from her own story. And for someone once known as the love goddess, there's something quietly heartbreaking about how alone she was in the end. Barbara Payton, she had the looks to rule Hollywood, and a fall so brutal it still stuns the industry today. Barbara Payton came to Hollywood with knockout looks, raw charisma, and the kind of energy that lit up a room. For a moment, it seemed like nothing could stop her. She starred alongside big names, landed magazine covers, and had the studios buzzing. But behind the camera, Barbara's life was spinning fast and dangerously out of control. Caught between two lovers, she was at the center of one of Hollywood's most public and violent love triangles. The tabloids had a field day, but Barbara? She never recovered from a fallout. Roles disappeared, friends backed away, and instead of clawing her way back, she fell further, harder than almost anyone. From luxury to Skid Row, she ended up hustling just to survive. No spotlight, no safety net. By the time she died, she was only 39. A starlet who once had it all, reduced to a cautionary tale. Barbara Payton's story isn't just about downfall, it's about what Hollywood does when it's done using you. James Dean, he lived fast, died young, and left behind more questions than answers. James Dean wasn't just a rising star, he was a cultural lightning bolt. With only 3 major films to his name, he managed to rewrite what it meant to be a leading man: sensitive, rebellious, magnetic. But off-screen, Dean was just as complex. He was intensely private, full of contradictions. One moment he was philosophical, quoting poetry. The next, he was racing cars like he had nothing to lose. People close to him said he carried a weight, something unspoken. Rumors about his personal life swirled even while he was alive, but no one dared ask him directly. Then came that infamous drive in 1955. A brand new sports car, an open highway, and just like that, he was gone at 24. The legend was born, but the man barely got started. Was he chasing something or running from it? We'll never really know. James Dean burned bright, but maybe the most haunting part is how little time it took for that flame to go out. Elizabeth Taylor, she was the queen of Hollywood, but her real life was more dramatic than any film she ever made. Elizabeth Taylor grew up on set, blossomed into a screen goddess, and lived a life so packed with love, loss, and scandal, it could fill a dozen scripts. 8 marriages, 7 husbands, tabloid frenzies, affairs that shook the industry. But what people often forget is how much pain she carried behind the diamonds and magazine covers. Taylor lived in near-constant physical discomfort from a young age, health struggles that led her down a long, quiet road of pills and dependency. She was in and out of hospitals, fighting to keep working while her body betrayed her again and again. And yet, she never played the victim. She made headlines for her relationships, but she also broke ground, being one of the first stars to publicly support AIDS research when others stayed silent. Elizabeth Taylor lived out loud, loved fiercely, and survived a system that often tried to chew her up. She wasn't just a star. She was a storm, and somehow she made it through. Robert Mitchum, he had a don't-care attitude on screen, and in real life, that nearly cost him everything. Robert Mitchum was the embodiment of cool, laid-back, gravel-voiced, and seemingly untouchable. He brought a quiet danger to every role, like a man who'd seen too much and wasn't about to explain himself. And maybe that was true. In 1948, at the height of his fame, Mitchum was caught up in something that could have ended any other actor's career: a drug arrest, complete with headlines and mugshots splashed across newspapers. For a moment, it looked like Hollywood's rebel was finished. But instead of hiding, Mitchum shrugged it off with a smirk. He served time, walked out, and kept working. Somehow, the scandal made him even more popular. Studios leaned into the bad boy image. But behind that tough exterior, Mitchum wrestled with his own demons: boredom, isolation, and a quiet dislike for the fame he couldn't seem to escape. He called acting a job, nothing more. But the truth is, he brought a rawness to the screen that only someone who'd lived close to the edge could. Mitchum didn't fake it. He was it. Buster Keaton, he made the world laugh while silently falling apart behind the scenes. Buster Keaton was a master of silent comedy, a genius with a stone face and a body that defied physics. His stunts were dangerous, his timing perfect, and his legacy legendary. But while audiences laughed, Buster was quietly losing control of everything else. The fame came fast, and so did the pressure to keep topping himself. When the studios took over his work, they stripped him of creative freedom, his lifeline. Suddenly, he wasn't the auteur, he was just another actor for hire. That loss hit him hard. He turned to the bottle, and for years, it was a fight he couldn't win. Marriages crumbled. Roles disappeared. For a time, it looked like one of Hollywood's brightest innovators might vanish completely. But Keaton didn't quit. Slowly, he rebuilt. The world eventually rediscovered him, not as a relic, but as a pioneer. Still, those lost years were real. The laughter he gave us, that came at a cost. Buster Keaton kept falling down for our entertainment, even when no one noticed he was hurting. Jean Harlow, she was Hollywood's original blonde bombshell, and her sudden end left a silence louder than any scandal. Before Monroe, before Hayworth, there was Jean Harlow, the first true blonde icon of the silver screen. She was dazzling, witty, and completely magnetic, with a glow that made her seem untouchable. But Harlow's rise came with a shadow. Her personal life was filled with heartbreak, a troubled marriage, strange rumors about her home life, and a mother who managed her career with an iron grip. Then, at just 26 years old, Harlow fell seriously ill. What began as simple fatigue quickly became something worse. Her condition declined rapidly, and within days, she was gone. The official word was organ failure, but many questions were never fully answered. Why wasn't she taken to the hospital sooner? Why so much secrecy around her final days? Some whispered about misdiagnosis, others about choices made too late. What's certain is that Hollywood lost one of its brightest stars far too soon, and the silence she left behind still echoes. Jean Harlow's story is a reminder that even the biggest stars can vanish without warning and without answers. Thelma Todd, she lit up the screen with laughter and was found cold, locked inside a car with no clear reason why. Thelma Todd was known as the Ice Cream Blonde, a sparkling mix of comedy, charm, and brains. She wasn't just funny, she was sharp. In a time when many actresses were seen but not heard, Thelma opened her own cafe, built her own brand, and played the game her way. But in 1935, everything stopped. She was found dead in her car, parked in a garage just a short walk from her home. The cause? Officially, carbon monoxide poisoning. But nothing about the scene made sense. The door was locked from the outside. Her shoes didn't match the muddy path she supposedly walked. And the night before? She'd been at a party, one filled with tension and powerful men. Rumors swirled for years. Was it an accident? Was someone sending a message? Or was it something darker that Hollywood didn't want uncovered? The case was closed without real answers, but people never stopped asking. Thelma Todd had a bright future, and it vanished overnight, leaving behind a mystery no one has ever solved. Gloria Grahame, she won an Oscar and lost everything chasing love and survival. Gloria Grahame had a face made for film noir, sultry, fragile, dangerous. She could play the femme fatale like no one else, and in 1952, she took home an Academy Award. But off-screen, her story was more twisted than any script she ever read. Her personal life became Hollywood rumor fuel, especially one scandal that nearly ended her career. After divorcing director Nicholas Ray, she later married his son, her former stepson, when he was an adult. The tabloids pounced. Studios backed away. Gloria kept working, but the roles were smaller, the spotlight colder. She battled health problems and financial instability in her later years, performing on stage just to pay the bills. Even as her life unraveled, she refused to slow down. But when illness caught up with her, she chose not to tell anyone, not even her children, until it was too late. Gloria Grahame burned fast, loved recklessly, and lived without apology. She didn't just play complicated women, she was one. They were icons, legends, untouchable on screen, but human behind the scenes. These old Hollywood stars gave the world unforgettable performances, but paid a price few ever saw. Some kept their secrets out of fear. Others had them buried by the studios. And a few took them to their graves. But now you've heard the stories, the ones whispered behind closed doors, the ones the spotlight never touched. So now we want to hear from you. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Which star do you see differently now? And do you think today's Hollywood is really any more honest than it was back then? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. If you found this journey into Hollywood's hidden past as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss what we uncover next. Because behind every legend, there's a story they never wanted told. And we're just getting started.